Hello, and welcome to this presentation where I'm going to discuss some common processes that English uses to grow its lexicon, that is, to come up with new words. By way of preface, I want to give some historical perspective. Right, English has lots of words. Sometimes you hear people who talk about this with a lot of pride. They really tout it like it somehow makes English a better language. But I really don't get the reasoning here. It doesn't matter that English has 2 million words as opposed to 1 million words. I don't know, maybe. One thing that is clear is that the word stock, the lexicon of English, has grown tremendously in the last few centuries. The figures cited here come from an analysis of the 80,000 words in the shorter OED. That was a two-volume abridgment of the main dictionary. When those words are counted by when they entered the language, this is what we find. So of those words, about 5.4% of them have been in English since Old English. So you can think of that as sort of the original, most of that is the original Germanic word stock of the language. But that's only like 5.5%. Another almost 19%, 18.9, came into English during the Middle English period. So a lot of these would be the French borrowings during that period. And then something like over 3/4 of the words, 75.7%, have entered English since modern English, so since around 1500, right? So that shows you that the depth of the vocabulary in terms of the time depth there for most of the words of the language is not very deep at all. So English has been acquiring new words at a tremendous rate, right? We've seen that with 3/4 of them have come in since in the last 500 years or so. So the main question is, how do we get new words? As we've discussed many times in studying the history of English, one of the main sources of new vocabulary that English has always relied on is borrowing, right? Taking words from other languages. It's called borrowing, but we don't usually give them back. Since the early modern period, this approach has accelerated due to political and cultural trends and events such as the Renaissance. The Renaissance, of course, led to a range of borrowing from the classical languages, Greek and Latin. So words like anarchy and aphrodisiac and decorate and emotion and so forth. These are all words that come into English from Greek and Latin sources. Right? We discussed earlier the inkhorn controversy, which was sparked by heavy borrowing of these words from Greek and Latin, or even the construction of these words from Greek and Latin roots. Right? So during this period, lots of new words were created, and not all of them survived. We have some examples of that here. So pistated from a Latin root meaning to bake, or homoglact for foster brother, demit for send away, and so forth. These are just examples of words that were used in the early modern period, clearly inkhorn terms in the sense of they were coined from Latin and Greek roots, but they just didn't survive for whatever reason. English has also always borrowed heavily from other European languages. Of course, we remember the influence of French during the Middle English period. Later we see borrowings like these from Italian, adagio, aria, macaroni, and so forth. Lots of familiar words there. From Dutch, lots of words related to seafaring and so forth. So commodore and cruise and reef and yacht and so forth. The spread of the British Empire around the world has put English into contact with lots of other languages, and it's of course led to further borrowing. So in the American case, right, the American languages, lots of words for flora and fauna of North America come from there. Words like moose and muskrat, pecan, and so forth. In South Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, for example, lots of words from Hindi and other Indian languages such as Bandana and Bengal and Cheetah and so forth. And of course, from other parts of Asia as well. Chinese is a huge influence in terms of the words that come from that language. This is just a very small sample of the kinds of languages that English has borrowed from. As you know from playing around in the OED, almost every language in the world has given some, at least every major language family has given words to English. One obvious way to get new words is just to make them up, right? To coin them from existing lexical material or even from wholly new material, right? Um, this is actually not very common. I mean, it's easy enough to coin new words, but it's another thing for them to catch on and become an established part of the language, as some of you are probably familiar
That is
with.
so fetch.
Gretchen, stop trying to make fetch happen. It's not going to happen.
So often new coinages appear, and when they do appear and sort of catch on, they're often in a commercial context, so trade names, names for new products, and so forth. So you have words like Kodak, the name of the company, or products like nylon and Teflon. Those are examples of new words, words that were coined fresh. The word quark is the physics term, right? Kind of subatomic particle term. That's kind of an exception here. It was actually made up by James Joyce, although it was sort of complicated. It was originally coined with an unrelated meaning, but then was adopted by physicists later on. In any case, new coinages are not a very big source of new words in English. One process that is maybe more common, pardon the pun, is commonization. Commonization is where you take a proper noun, right, also known as an eponym, and it becomes a common noun, right? So a noun for a particular thing comes to be used as a noun for a common noun for any kind of that thing. So you have examples of people's names, boycott, and sandwich, and sadistic. I'm sure you're familiar with the Earl of Sandwich story. Sadistic is from the Marquis de Sade. You may remember as a sort of famous 18th century mean person. Then there are also other ones that come from places. Mocha is, I think, in Yemen. Bikini, the Bikini Atoll, where they did a lot of nuclear testing. Jean is from Genoa in Italy, and so forth. So lots of these examples in English. Sort of closely related to this process of commonization is the case where a brand name, name of a product, comes to be used as a generic name for that type of product, right? This is called genericization, which I'm sure you'll agree is fun to say. But you are certainly familiar with the use of Kleenex to refer to any facial tissue, or Band-Aid to refer to any kind of adhesive bandage, right? Escalator, you might not know that was originally a brand name, Escalator. And Hoover was a kind of vacuum cleaner. We don't use Hoover as a generic too much in American English, but in British English, it's often used, actually often used as a verb, to hoover, meaning to vacuum up something. Back formation is an interesting, really a morphological process. The basic definition is that you have simpler words derived from complex and multimorphemic words, right? So the idea is that a word with two or more morphemes, right? That's what multimorphemic means. That word is cut to remove one of those morphemes. In almost all cases, the removed part is a suffix. We can see this in the example of editor. So editor was a word that was borrowed from Latin in 1649, and it was processed as edit plus or, and then eventually the or was cut off, and the verb edit, to edit a document, for example, was backformed from it, right? And that appears much later in 1791. So the complex word editor is processed as two morphemes, cut off the suffix, and you get the verb edit. It's not hard to see how that happens. You have other examples of models like actor and even writer, where it's spelled with an ER instead of an OR, but you get the idea. A more recent example is the case of the verb babysit, which appears first in 1946 according to the OED. It clearly derives from the earlier form babysitter, right? So babysitter is a sort of classic compound word where you have the noun plus the agent noun sitter attached there, and then you cut off the suffix er to get the verb babysit. This is a very common process in English today. Sometimes this process of back formation is a little more interesting because it doesn't rely on existing morphemes, but sort of reanalyzes the structure of the word to impose a additional morpheme, right? It's a kind of false analogy. Here's a really clear example. The word cherry, the name of the fruit, comes from an old French word, cherries, which is at the end, right? So the e's at the end, pronounced there, sounds like a plural, and so they, even though it was not a plural originally, and so they cut off that ending, the s sound at the end, to get the singular cherry, right? So cherry comes from cherries by removing the z sound at the end, and in order to do that, you had to analyze it as a suffix, a plural marker. Right? We actually talked about a similar example, the case of the vegetable pea was originally peas, so that s was not originally a plural marker, but it came to be a plural marker. It came to be seen as a plural marker. That's what I mean by reanalysis. And then you backform the singular p by removing that suffix, the s sound. One other much more recent example is the verb verse. You may have heard this. It's very common in video game context. Someone is going to verse someone else, or we were versing each other or something like that. So it means something like to play against, right? So it's clearly a reanalysis of the preposition, the Latin preposition versus, right? And you can see how that comes about. So if you say team A versus team B, right, you can reanalyze versus not as a preposition but as a verb in the present tense. And if that's the case, then the versus is verse plus us. The us is seen as the third person singular present tense verb suffix, right? Team A versus them. So if one team versus another, then one team is versing. Two teams verse two other teams, right? So you can see how the verb is backformed by reanalyzing that us part of the versus as a suffix. It's kind of a delightful example for me. Okay, clipping. Clipping is a process that results in a shorter word, so it's much like backformation in that sense, but it's actually a fundamentally different kind of process, because in clipping, you're not removing morphemes, right? You're not removing meaningful parts like suffixes. Rather, it's purely phonological, right? It's just about removing sounds. You don't analyze the sounds as adding meaning. They're just sounds, right? So you can see this in the case of flu, which is a shortening from influenza, or zoo, which is a shortening from zoological or zoological garden, right? Ad, or in British English, advert, from advertisement or advertisement. And then it was also very common in college topics, right? Econ, I have an econ class instead of economics and so forth. So you can see these are clipping because you're just removing sounds. Take the last example there. Econ, economics, the anomics is not analyzed as a suffix that is removed to form a different word. It's just shortening the word by removing some sounds, right? So clipping is similar to backformation in that it results in a shortening, but it's fundamentally different because it doesn't involve reanalyzing the structure of the word. It's just about getting rid of sounds. Blending is a phenomenon that has become increasingly common, I think, in the last century or so. It involves the combination of two free morphemes, right? So not suffixes and prefixes, but freestanding morphemes. So it's like compounding in that sense, right? Compounding is where you get words like blackbird or sweatpants, where you just combine two free morphemes, two words that could stand by themselves. But with blending, the two morphemes, they don't survive intact, right? One or both of them is reduced as the two are sort of blended together. So classic examples of this include words like smog, right, which is a combination of smoke and fog, and motel, which is a combination of motor and hotel because they were originally associated with driving, right? They show up on highways. More recent examples are things like edutainment, which obviously combines education and entertainment, or the very tasty tomesto, which is a combination of tomato and pesto, right? So again, they're blendings because you can see the two morphemes that combine, but they're sort of smushed together, so they don't. The whole parts of each morpheme don't survive. Sometimes we get a new word from an old one without adding or subtracting anything. We just start using it in new ways. And this is called functional shift, or sometimes just conversion. It's where a word that is one part of speech comes to be used as another part of speech. And crucially in this process, the word doesn't change its form at all. There's no suffix added. There's nothing removed. It's just the word looks the same, but it comes to be used as a different part of speech. So you can see this in an example of the noun run, as in go for a run, or in a baseball context, score a run, right? That's clearly from the verb run. So run's originally a verb. It comes to be used as a noun via this process of functional shift. We saw this example earlier in a discussion of inkhorn terms. They so Latin their tongues, right? The use of Latin, which is obviously a noun or an adjective, used here as a verb. They Latin their tongues, right? This is sort of a one-off usage, perhaps, but again shows this functional shift. Other common examples would be things like ups and downs, where you have nouns that have been shifted from original prepositions, right? Up goes to up, and down, the prepositions go to these used as nouns. They're made plural here, but of course they could also be singular. So functional shift is again just changing the grammatical usage, the part of speech usage of a word, without adding or subtracting anything to its form. Alphabetism is a kind of general term for where the first letter of a phrase is used. The first letter of words in a phrase are used to form new words for that, right? So it's common to distinguish two main types. There's initialisms. Initialisms, words like TV and FBI, are ones where the letters are pronounced as letters, right? TV, FBI, you just say each letter. This is different from the acronym. An acronym is where the letters are pronounced as if they're a word, right? So you're probably familiar with SCUBA as an acronym for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, or if you weren't familiar with it, now you are. But notice we don't call it SCUBA, we call it SCUBA. We pronounce it as a word, so that's why it's an acronym. Same thing with words like NATO, right? We don't say NATO, we say NATO for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Of course, you're also familiar with CHUD there. If not, I recommend this excellent film from 1984, CHUD, which of course is an acronym for Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dweller. Actually, on the topic of alphabetism, I want to mention one other thing, and that's something that's known as a backronym. Backronyms are examples where it's an acronym, so it looks just like a regular acronym, but the process is a little bit different. So the process, it's called a backronym because what happened is the acronym part came first, and then the etymology, the source for that acronym, is sort of invented later. So an example like this is SAD, to refer to seasonal affective disorder, right? That disorder where people need sun. They feel deprived of sun in the winter. So it's called SAD because they often feel sad. But that's clearly an acronym that was created first, and then the title seasonal affective disorder came later. Another example is PUSH, Operation PUSH, one of the organizations that Jesse Jackson founded. The PUSH there stands for People United to Serve Humanity, but obviously they came up with PUSH first, and then they sort of made up the acronym to go with it, right? So that's why it's a backronym. The word PUSH or SAD comes first, and then the source for that is invented later. Oftentimes, backronyms are sort of made up, or they're sort of come to be false etymologies for words, or etymologies for words. You've probably heard of some of these. So sometimes you have people who feel really smart because they say, oh, I just learned that the reason we say this is because of this. One example you may have heard of is tips, as in giving tips to waiters, servers, and so forth. They say, oh, well, it's called tips because it's an acronym for to ensure prompt service. It's not. That's a completely made up history of that word, but it's kind of a fun thing. Another one that maybe is less familiar to you is the word posh. Posh, meaning high class or something like that, is said to have originally been from port out, starboard home, which is where when you're booking your cruise to England back, you want to make sure that you get a room on the port side on the way out and a starboard side on the way home. Those are the good rooms there. Of course, that's not at all where the word posh comes from, but it's a lovely story. one final example that you may be familiar with. Sometimes people come up with examples like this, the idea that a word comes from the phrase for unlawful carnal knowledge. It's a very popular, completely false etymology for that word. So it's fun. Okay, so those are some of the common processes for creating new words in English and actually in other languages as well. There's certainly other sources for building a vocabulary, including general patterns like derivation, adding suffixes, for example, to change a noun to an adjective. There are more exotic things like reduplication, which we don't really use too much in English, at least not in pattern ways. But the ones we've covered here are responsible for a good amount of the increase in the size of the English vocabulary, the English lexicon, in the last few centuries. So, until next time.